our family come from?
Well, on my side of our family, I grew up in California, as you know, and my parents grew up in Oklahoma and moved to California as adults. And on my mom's side, her ancestors came from Germany and from Holland. My maternal grandfather, his last name is Estal. My mom's maiden name is German. And then my maternal grandmother, her family came from Holland. And my maiden name, Hals, is a Norwegian name. So my father's great grandparents came to America from Norway.
How do you know?
Nowadays you can verify all your ancestors', history if you're willing to do the research. But the way I learned it was from my parents and from aunts and uncles and from my grandparents.
So verbally?
Yes, verbally.
How many generations can you trace back from your parents?
I wish I could say it was much more, but when I was in elementary school, I had to do a family tree type project, and so I have all the names and like their birth dates and how long they lived and where they lived, information like that, 3 generations back from me.
So you have names, places of birth, and birthdays?
Yes.
Could you share a few?
Sure. And one thing I think is interesting, Ashley, is your middle name, Elizabeth. You were named after 2 of your great grandmothers. So, so my maternal grandmother, she went by Bessie, but her, Bessie Estal was her married name. She was born in 1899. And she died in 1972. So she died when I was 10 years old. But I think it's really interesting too. You were born in 1999. She was born in 1899, and you were named after her.
Nice. So do we have any veterans in our family?
The only ones that I am aware of on my side of your family, because you'll talk to Dad about his family. But on my side, my dad and one of my dad's brothers both served during World War II. And my uncle actually died at Normandy Beach in France. So we were able to go and visit the American cemetery there and see where he's buried. But my dad served for 3 years. He was in the Navy in World War II, and he served on a aircraft carrier. And then, of course, when you talk to Dad, you'll have a chance to hear all about that.
So can you tell me any stories about our family? Your side.
That's a really open-ended question. Well, I mean, something that ties in a lot with like the history of America, since that's what this class is about. Back during, the late 1800s, early 1900s, what was very, very common in the United States was for families to be very large, because one of the primary, incomes was through farming. And so my father grew up on a farm in Oklahoma and was one of 10 children. So that would be extremely, rare nowadays, but back then it wasn't that rare.
Do we have any genealogical records?
I have different cousins who have done a lot of research in terms of getting more photos and more detailed information together. So yes, on my both on my mom's side of the family, so the Estal family, and on the Halls families, I have different cousins and relatives who've done more. I would like to do more. Like, one of the things I have is a lot of memorabilia from when my dad was in World War II. But that is something I would love to do when I have a little more time. I would love to, and I would love to visit, especially Oslo, Norway. where my dad's family is from. I've never visited Norway, and I would love to do that. I have been to Holland and Germany, and we've been to Wales, which Lewis obviously is Welsh.
Where did our family come from?
Well, actually, we're typical North Carolinians. We've been here for a long time. My family, the Lewis name, first Lewis came over in 1721 from Wales. We have also a little bit of English ancestry, some Swiss ancestry, and on my mom's side, even some French as well.
How do you know?
Well, actually have a few different family members on both sides who are very much into tracing the family lineage. There's a few publications about our families, and plus have a very large family. People tend to live a really long time, so you get a lot of the history firsthand.
How many generations can you trace back from your parents?
Well, I mean, actually, I have one book that traces our lineage all the way back to people who came over during the Norman Conquest in 1066 from Normandy in France on to England. So some of them go back quite far, but since 1721, I've got direct lineage of people who came over from Wales.
Can you recall names or places of birth or birthdays?
Tons of them. Yeah, I mean, I liked birthdays, but interestingly, my parents, your grandparents were both born in 1928, and your grandmother was born right here in Raleigh. Your granddad was his family was from here, but they happened to be living in Georgia, so he was born in Thomasville, Georgia, January 24th, 1928. But of your grandparents, of your great grandparents, my four grandparents, three of those were born in the 19th century. So the only one who was born in the 20th century was my father's mother, and she was born in 1905, and you knew her, so she lived to be almost 104 years old.
Do we have any veterans in our family?
Quite a few. Actually, as you know, my father, your grandfather, who died 2 years ago, was a colonel in the Army, and so he was a career Army officer. Obviously, you knew him very well, but you have your cousin by marriage, who is a Navy SEAL. My uncle Robert, whose birthday's today, by the way, was an officer in the Navy. Your cousin Will was a sailor in the Navy as well. So we have quite a few of that in our recent history, but also just going further back, there's a long history of that in your family. We had people on both sides of the Civil War. As a matter of fact, my great grandfather, your great grandfather, was from Eastern North Carolina, but because his family was abolitionists. Early in the war, he ran away from home at 13 years old and was one of the youngest soldiers in the Union Army to fight against slavery.
Can you tell me any other stories about our family?
Oh, quite a bit. His daughter actually was your great grandmother's mother, Lucy Voliva, and she was quite a character. She married a minister. Who was actually one of the founders of Mount Olive University here in North Carolina. But she lived to be 96, I think, and lived with her daughter, my grandmother. So I knew her quite well, and she used to tell me stories all the time about her father, who had been in the Civil War. And he obviously survived the Civil War, but died early. I think he was in his 30s, died of a illness, some kind of stomach illness that he never really recovered fully from, that he caught during the Civil War, and because of that, his widow was forced to raise three daughters as a single mother in the 1870s, 1880s, that time period. So very interestingly, she ran a riverboat on the Neuse River in New Bern, North Carolina. So it's about a mile wide there. It's a much bigger river than it is here. but that riverboat would go back and forth from one side to the bank to the other, and she would take on passengers. And apparently, in the past, there had been gambling on there, and there had been a fire on this gambling casino. There was a fire, and at least one person died. So, rumor was it that this was actually a haunted riverboat, and my great grandmother grew up on this boat. But she told me a story one time about when there was a big storm, a snowstorm, and the river actually froze. And if you can imagine the Neuse River being a mile wide and being frozen here, so obviously it was a very cold winter. But the riverboat was actually stuck in dock on one side of the river, but unfortunately her school was on the other side of the river. And so her mother asked two hired men to take an ice skiff, which is sort of like a boat with a sail. It's a sailboat, but actually has rudders like a sleigh. And they took this ice skiff across the river to the other side to take her to school. And their job was, of course, was to wait. They took her in the morning, and they waited all day for her to take her home in the afternoon. And she, if I recall, she was 7 years old at the time. But, of course, where did they wait? They waited in the saloon. So by the time they went to pick her up, they were very drunk. And as a result of that, trying to get across the river, they actually turned the skiff over. And I saw a little bit of this even in her 90s. She's a feisty little thing. And even as a 7-year-old, she got mad at them. They're fumbling with trying to get this skiff upright. So she just took off walking maybe half a mile across the river, the frozen river, as a 7-year-old, if you can imagine. So needless to say, her mother was not happy with those men when they got home.
Do we have any genealogical records?
Yeah, actually quite a few. I have my Uncle Robert, the same one I mentioned, who's a Navy officer. He is very much into genealogy. So he's been sort of the keeper of the family records. He's probably the best resource on that on my father's side. And on my mother's side, the same thing, that my mother has a cousin who's done quite a bit of research as well. So we have that. I've seen quite a bit of records from the Conyers side of the family, who came from France. They were French Protestants, the Huguenots, who were persecuted and had to leave France, and actually went to Bermuda. One of the descendants was later the royal governor of Bermuda, prior to them coming to North Carolina via Charleston, South Carolina. Then on my father's side, my father's father's mother was a Finch, and those records are actually published. There's a book called The Finch Families of Dixie that has detailed genealogical records of the Finch family as well. So yes, quite a bit.